morning session of third day conference on indigenous knowledge and climate change. So I am taking over as moderator for this session, and with us we have Professor Virginius Khaka for the session. Welcome to the session, sir.
Thank you.
To give a brief introduction, Professor Virginius is currently a visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development, New Delhi. He held postdoctoral fellowship under Indo-French Cultural Program at Paris, Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellow at School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, Fulbright Fellow at the University of California, Santa Cruz, USA. Earlier, he was the chair of the High-Level Committee on Socio-Economic Health and Educational Status of Tribal Communities of India, Government of India in 2014. To name a few, he's the author of State, Society and Tribes, issue in Post-Colonial India, published by Pearson in 2008, co-editor of Social Exclusion and Adverse Inclusion, Development and Deprivation of Adivasi in India, published by Oxford University Press in 2012. Work Institution and Sustainable Livelihood, Issues and Challenges of Transformation, published in 2017, and his latest publication is on Employment and Labor Market in Northeast India, Interrogation Structural Change in 2019. For this session, we have Dr. Hanto Choppy, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Central University of Excellence, as the discussant. To give a brief introduction, he is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Northeast India Studies, Utkal University, Bhubaneswar, Orissa. He was a fellow of coveted New India Foundation Fellowship in 2017. He has also served as an assistant professor at the Department of Tribal Studies, Central University of Jharkhand between 2013 and 16. He has contributed research papers in several peer-reviewed journals and chapters on the areas of comparative religion, tribal issues, Indo-Myanmar border, and traditional system. His recent publication is Christianity and Politics in Tribal India. This was published in 2000. Professor Virginius to talk about indigenous people and their worldview. So you can start the lecture now.
Thank you, Dr. Kuzu, for the introduction, and thank you for extending these invitations at this international conference on indigenous knowledge and climate change, issues, challenges, and coping mechanisms. Climate change, as we all know, is global problems today, and all organizations, international, national, even at the local, whether you talk about the academics or you talk about the civil society organizations, they're all concerned about these various issues of climate change. And climate change, therefore, one can see visible at even very local level in terms of way in which you find that either the weather or either in terms of the rain and other kinds of fluctuations that are really taking place even at the local level. And people have begun to recognize the fact that climate change is a real issue today. So there has always been a concern now as to how to contain this. And in this context, it is generally now accepted that the indigenous knowledge and indigenous lifestyle or indigenous ethics can be an important way in which one can address the issues of climate change. And therefore, this international conference is valuable because the ideas that may come from these deliberations might be useful in terms of trying to find out as to what are the ways in which probably one can think of addressing this phenomenal problem of the climate change. We all know that climate change is largely a factor which has emerged in the last 400 years, particularly with the expansion of the colonial rule. The scale of productions have, following the Industrial Revolution, it has just gone expanded, and is not only in Britain or in Europe, but almost in every part of the world. And the scale of production is primarily based on inanimate source of power. So what you call the human and animal power, on the basis of which earlier the livelihood are based, that has been replaced by inanimate source of power. And this inanimate source of power, whether you use coal, whether you use oil, whether you use gas, and it has led to a phenomenal increase in the mass productions, and you can see it at the level of industry and the way industry has expanded, and the kind of benefit this growth or the industrial expansion that take place in the lives of the people. So now the transport or communications or even our lifestyle is heavily dependent on the energy, and the amount of energy that we are consuming is actually coming by what is called over exploitations of the natural resources. So the nature, the way in which we have consumed nature, in the way in which we have exploited nature in the last 400 years, it probably is the result of what we are witnessing today and what is really being talked about in terms of climate change. So I think it's an important issue. Now, there are different ways in which one can think about, and scientists, they're all been thinking about it. But as a social scientist too, we have been deliberating and talking about it. And in social sciences, one of the issues which generally have been articulated is that probably there's a great deal to learn as to how to manage or how to relate oneself with the natural world. And that may really come from what we know as the indigenous worldview. Now, indigenous, I think it is important for us as to how we think about the indigenous. This idea of indigenous, of course, took crystallize, following the, what is called, I think in 1993, the declarations of the International Decades of the Indigenous People. And since then, there has been a lot of engagement and discussions on the indigenous issues, particularly on the working group on indigenous people, and leading to the declarations of what is called the UN Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People, and what is called United Forum of the Indigenous UN Forum at Indigenous People. So there are all kinds of organizations which have come up, and this kind of development which has taken place at the international level, it has also in a way impacted the various kinds of agencies and organizations. And therefore, increasingly, we are talking about the indigenous people and their worldview, their lifestyle. And if we really look at today, that wherever there are indigenous people, you find that the biodiversity or the forest or you find other kinds of resources are relatively more intact than the regions where they are conspicuously absent. So somewhere else you find that there is a correlations between the what is called the preservations of the nature of the what is called of the natural resources and the indigenous people. And to that extent, therefore, if they have been able to preserve, let's say even at the level where they have been living for so many years, that means there is some way in which one can really think about it. Now, it is in this context that I would like to locate my discussions, let's say, in reference to what is known generally as tribal people in India. And my focus will be not so on tribals as a whole, but mostly on the little that I know about the tribes from the central Indian regions, Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or neighboring regions. So some knowledge that I have out of reading and out of discussions with other people. So based on that, I'll try to put place my view as to how this indigenous worldview can really be contributing to containing the climate change. Now, in case of in India, this whole idea of indigenous is quite problematic because the way in which it is conceptualized is somewhat very varied in the sense, because we talk of indigenous at a different level and in different meanings. We can talk about indigenous medicines or indigenous health system, which can be, let's say, Ayurvedic is indigenous. You can talk about the Unani as a health system. Maybe I don't know about homeopath, that can also be talked about. So the whole idea here is, therefore, when you talk about indigenous, it is not referring to in terms of the people who are identified as indigenous people at the global at the global level. So because here when you talk of indigenous, it's primarily being referred to in terms of what do you call the modern. So the modern medicines has come up with the coming of the colonial rule, and to some extent, therefore, the modern educational system or modern health system has been a product of colonialism. It is and it is associated somewhere as like modernization. So often you find that we try to contrast the indigenous knowledge, indigenous health system, indigenous what is called food, indigenous trace, in comparisons to what has really come from the from the West, or from other than the country in which we belong. And so that is, I think, one way. So external and modern seems to be conflated, and it is at that backdrop that one really wants to see as to what is really indigenous. And so that is, one can't really take that. But when you're talking about in terms of indigenous knowledge, at the global level, then I think it primarily refers to the worldview of the indigenous people. And therefore, indigenous, when you use the term indigenous in the context of India, it becomes very, very problematic because indigenous worldview, it can be the worldview of the dominant populations in India, but it can be the worldview of also the people who are on the margins of the society, or people who are identified as tribes. And and therefore that also, and therefore the indigenous becomes very ambiguous term as far as India is concerned. And the meaning, either, as I said, either it is related with the modern versus local, or modern versus traditional, or external versus the local. So it is, also becomes that. But I think I would like to really take this what is called the meaning in which I'm trying to locate the indigenous is more in the context of the indigenous people as it is used at the global level. And at the global level, we find that indigenous people are generally associated with those who have already been there in the geographical territory before the arrival of the colonialists, or before the arrival of the colonial rule. And this is, of course, much specifically or much clearly can be identified in the context of the Americas, where you talk of Latin America, or you talk of United States of Canada, or Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth, where you find that there are already people, and as to how they have been dominated or rather subjugated, and you find that they are now in a state of what is called the dominations and subjugations, but nevertheless, and over and above, they also continue to manage to regulate their life in terms of their own traditions, customs, rules, and regulations, and so on and so forth. So it is in that context that indigenous people has really been used. And coming to in India, therefore, we don't really accept, government of India does not accept this concept, does not accept the term indigenous in this sense of the term, because it thinks that everyone in India is indigenous. Because if you take the colonial rule as the benchmark, as the yardstick, then all those who were here before the coming of the colonial rule are all indigenous. But then it does accept that, well, generally indigenous in India is used with people who are identified with tribal communities, or what is known as scheduled tribes. This is very ambivalent positions that the officials hold as far as this idea of indigenous is concerned. Now, therefore, when we talk about the worldview, indigenous worldview, I think how do we really study that? Because indigenous people did not have the tradition of reading and writing, and therefore they were not a literate society, and therefore they didn't really live for us document, the books, what you call writings, and so on and so forth. So largely, therefore, when you're trying to understand indigenous knowledge, we look back into their myths, into their legends, into what is called their stories, and customary, what is called customary systems, customary laws, customary rules, ethics, values, etc. So that is the way in which we try to do it. And to my mind, it is, since there is no literal writing, and sometimes you find that even the customs and traditions, they keep on changing, and therefore we cannot really trace at what point of time these customs and traditions really emerge. I would like to focus, let's say, in terms of understanding climate change, or rather indigenous knowledge, more in terms of the way in which people actually manage their life, in the way they conduct themselves. And when we talk about conducting themselves, we would like to look at in terms of three important aspects in terms of which indigenous peoples are connected. One is indigenous people are invariably connected with the supernatural world. Their supernatural is an important part of their life. The other is the natural world. And because the natural world is invariably created by the great creator, the God, or whatever you may say, or the great spirit. So it is a creation of the great spirit. And therefore you find the nature and the supernatural are to some extent interdependent. And then the third dimension is that as to how indigenous people, therefore, they relate with their fellow human beings. So when we are trying to understand the worldview, we have to really take these three dimensions in terms of as to how they relate with the supernatural, how they relate with the natural, and how they relate with their fellow human beings. And in this, trying to understand this worldview, you find that there is a lot of interlinkage between the supernatural, natural, and the what is called the human world. Now, so if you really to take this is important, and therefore this worldview, it's somewhere else has been important in terms of the way in which they have tried to conduct themselves with the natural world. Now, as I said that for them, the universe or the world is a creation of the supernatural, the creation of the great spirit, whatever term, whatever name that you really give. And that has been given for the use of the people, for the use of the people who have been created. Now, in the process, what you find that so if you look at the creation stories of many of the tribes, you will find that, well, they created, it's not only human beings, but they created also the spirits. So there are malevolent spirits, there are benevolent spirits, there are ancestral spirits. So you find that there are in the creation, in the supernatural world, you find, yes, the great spirit, but then we know that there are also other spirits which could be and then the spirits can be cosmic as well as non-cosmic. Cosmics are the ones who might be floating, but the non-cosmics, which are actually abode of the natural world. So if you take the Niamgiri tribes who have been protesting against the Vedanta project, they said that we will not allow mines, the hills to be mined, because that is the abode of our king. It is the holy, it is the sacred. And therefore, you find that in the tribal world, you find that many of the pockets, many of the regions, whether it be water pool, or it could be forest, or it could be river, or it could be a hillock, or it could be a forest, which is a abode of a deity. And therefore, you have always an attitude of respect and reverence to the natural world. If you want to convert that into the mundane world in terms of cultivations or shifting agriculture, you have to do certain kind of rituals. You know, you have to pacify, you have to appease, you have to offer something to the deities, or the what they call deity, which is where that really abodes. And therefore, you find that there is a kind of attitude of reverence to the natural world. And when you transform it into your mundane world, then also you have to go through this ritual process, and this ritual process therefore enables you to make it as a kind of non-sacred or profane in terms of the Durkheimian word of the sense. So that is where you really find, and therefore you find that the relationship of the indigenous people with the natural, what is called the natural world, is also understood in terms of the being and the sacred. And you have many tribal communities, particularly in central India, you find they are the sacred space. You see, they have sacred geography. Of either the salt tree, or these are all getting inundated because of the way in which minings and industrial development have taken place. But traditionally, they hide in a place. So, and which is considered to be sacred. And it is not only one tribe, but almost all tribes used to consider that. So there are different ways in which you find through the sphere of the supernatural or supernatural of thinking, you actually in a way contributing to the natural world, contributing to the maintenance of the natural world. Now, it's not only through your idea of the supernatural that you are in a way able to contribute, but even if you look at the natural world, you find that the natural world for the tribals or indigenous people is a world which is a part of the supernatural world. They don't really dichotomize that the supernatural world and the natural world. In fact, anthropologists have used this. In fact, for them, this is a moral world. In the natural world is a moral world. They are part of it. A supernatural is a part of it. The nature is a part of it. So it is a moral world. And therefore, you have a moral obligations, not only to the supernatural, but also you have an obligation to the natural world. And therefore, you find that the natural world, again, if you really look at in terms of the tribals or indigenous people, you find that, they never over-exploit the natural resources. This, I'm trying to see the timing. So they never exploit the resources. So for example, if you ask their livelihood, they never dependent on one particular source of livelihood. Even when they're shifting agriculture, you find that they are dependent on hunting, they are depending on food gathering, and therefore you find that they are on very, very dependent on more than one modes of livelihood, and therefore never a particular natural resources is overexploited. So you find that way you can preserve it. It gets regenerated because you are never over exploiting in terms of your cultivations, etc. So you have using the nature and you're trying to derive the source of livelihood. Maybe agriculture is there, but then it is extremely expansively supported by the others. For example, in case of tribals in central India, you find that almost 60 to 70% of the food diets or medicinals comes from the forest, not necessarily from their own cultivations. So it is sort of dependent. So even when you find that what is called what is called, so you find that there is this attitude of the fact that nature has been given for use, for subsistence, and not really for accumulation. So if you really look at people, even when they reclaim forest, they reclaim forest or land to the extent it is necessary for their existence. Therefore, they never accumulated. But if they had the tendency to accumulate, they could have accumulated large chunk of forest at their private land, but that's not what happened. So you find that there is this sense of the fact that you appropriate nature only to the extent it is necessary for you and not for really an accumulations. So if you look at therefore, you find that indigenous vision is very ecological. It is very, what is called ecological. It is very sacred. It is something which is given for use and only consumption and not for accumulations. And therefore, you find that is also reflected in the social world. So you find that if the land has to be reclaimed for cultivation, even in shifting cultivations, you find that people gave land to the different families based on their needs. How many people are really there in the family who can work? And therefore, it is not something like appropriating to a maximum, but you distribute the land among the people to the extent that they have a workforce in the family. And so you find that invariably you are trying to maintain a kind of an egalitarian system. In tribal society, indigenous people, you find that the relationship is one of reciprocity. So there is the kinship-based social organizations, and reciprocity turns out to be the most important. And when you have reciprocity, you find that it is extends even to the larger part of the human relationship. So you have, because of the kinship, because of the reciprocity, you find that there is a generally a philosophy of egalitarianism. Some privileges some may have, because that is everywhere. The position a headman may have, a position a chief may have, therefore certain advantages. But by and large, you find that there's a kind of an egalitarianism there. You also find that the decisions which are really made is more of a democratic. As a village assembly, they will decide, and decisions are made not on the basis of the majority, but on the basis of consensus, so that they reach as to how to handle a particular issues. There is a consensus among them. So what I'm trying to say is that if you really look at the worldview of the indigenous people, you have to look at in terms of as to how their attitude, what is their orientation to the supernatural, what is their orientation to the natural, and what is their orientation to their own fellow beings. And if you really look at this in an integrated manner, then you find that for them, you cannot really dichotomize these three different aspects, but they are all interdependent. There's a mutual relationship between all the three, and it is therefore gives a kind of a worldview, and a worldview where you find that everyone has a place, in a sense that humans, the natural and the supernatural must really exist in a coexistence with each other, and that is something very, very important. And this is a message, and this is the reason to my mind as to why you find that they are able to preserve the forest, they are able to preserve the biodiversity, and that is what we really find empirically visible today. You go, even India, you go to where is the dense forest, you find that it's all there where indigenous people are living, whether you talk of a central India or peninsular India or talk of northeast India. So there is a great deal of conformity between what we see as an empirical in terms of rich forest, rich biodiversity, and the lifestyle, or the people who really live there and their lifestyle. And therefore their lifestyle, the thinking, their orientations, their knowledge, probably a great deal has something to say about the preserving the natural world. And it is precisely because we are able to preserve the natural world that to some extent, therefore, we have been able to contain the climate change. And this is what the scientists have also been saying, that because if there's a forest, then it can absorb the carbon dioxide. So that is where you really find, and therefore, but then because of the larger climate change, it's also in a way impacting them, and therefore there is a need as to how best we can really mitigate that. So broadly, very synoptically, what I'm saying is that it is the interdependence between the nature, the supernatural, and fellow human beings, which really gives a worldview, and worldview which is primarily marked by egalitarianism, marked by respect for the nature, and respect for the supernatural, because it is from the supernatural that nature and the human beings have been created. So this is the way in which I just wanted to articulate, and in this way probably one can understand as to how indigenous worldview in fact can contribute to what is called mitigating the problems that is emerging in respect to the climate change. Thank you. Sorry for taking a little more time.
Thank you, sir, for a very insightful session. I have a lot of questions actually, but I'll reserve that for later. So now I would request Dr. Kanato to take the session forward.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kujur, for giving me this time. It is such a privilege for me to be sharing this panel with Professor Virginius. He's a person whom I quote extensively in my writings as well as in my lectures. So it is, as I said, it's such a wonderful privilege to be sharing this panel with him. Also, I want to thank the program organizers of Central University of Jharkhand for giving me this time to talk about on this such an important topic. I think which me, as a tribal, as someone belonging to so-called indigenous community is concerned about. So very broadly, I think Sir has succinctly stated some issues. One issue that he has particularly raised about is how this climate change is becoming a local issue. And then as far as climate change is concerned, the communities or other people who are most vulnerable are the indigenous people. People who are much more vulnerable, who are going to be, as far as the effects of climate change is concerned. I think these are indigenous people or people, the tribal communities who are going to be much affected. So I think that was a very relevant point which Sir has talked about the problems of how climate change has become a local issue. In relation to I think this is a issue which Sir also has written extensively about. There's a brilliant article he wrote in EPW, Tribes as Indigenous People. I think there's a whole debate that he has covered about the problems of how to define indigenous, or how to, vis-a-vis the tribes in India. So I really I won't be going into that debate, because I think that is a different debate altogether. But just as a whole, one thing that we have to really understand or really take into consideration is that there seems to be something called indigenous knowledge system, which has been quite rather very much discussed about, which has been talked about, written about, and people from different fields are actually talking about these indigenous knowledge systems. So what Professor Khaka has done is, I think he has been able to locate, to differentiate, this whole idea of what indigenous knowledge is all about, what indigenous worldview is about. And it's quite fascinating. He gave three important points talking about indigenous worldview in terms of the supernatural, the natural, and as well as the relationship with fellow human beings. I think we should be able to really locate the whole indigenous worldview within these three paradigms. And I think much has also been written and much researches are being done. But one thing that I want to actually add to Sir's point is that Sir also talked about how the coming of colonial powers, or how modernity has very much aggravated consumerist behavior. Yes, so much so that I think it has posed a huge challenge. It has posed a huge problem to environmental degradation, as well as our behaviors relating to overconsumption of certain things. So this is one issue that we, I think, have to be talking about, because I belong to a tribal community, and I know we are at a juncture where, especially, Sir has talked a lot about tribes from Central India. I have lived there for 3 years. But if I have to make a comparison between tribes or indigenous people from Central India and Northeast India, I think tribes in Northeast India are developing at a much more faster rate with regards to modernization, with regards to adopting what I may call as certain Western values as well. So in this context, this whole idea of coming back to the discussion on indigenous worldview is very important, because in one of the researches that I was doing just briefly, I could see that there has been massive destruction with regards to sacred groves. I belong to a Naga tribe, and then I did, with one of my fellow researchers, we were doing an assessment of sacred groves in Nagaland, and there are various sacred groves. But one of the reasons that why there seems to be a decline, or why this sacred groves are being undergoing destruction is because of the change in worldview. I think, change in the worldview. I think that is a very important aspect that we could find. Of course, certain factors like coming of to building roads, or certain developmental projects also have very much played a major role in the destruction of sacred groves. But I think one of the main reasons why there seems to be a change in the attitude towards sacred groves, I think, which really plays a huge role. And this is just one part of the tribal beliefs and practices, but which plays a rather very important role in preserving environment as well as mitigating, climate change, or as well as contributing to the whole ecological system. I think there seems to be rather a change in the worldview. And then what is actually happening is that with regards to sacred groves, Professor Kaka talked about the three dimensions of the supernatural, the natural, as well as the human dimension. And one of the reasons why tribes are abandoning sacred groves is also because of they don't regard sacred grove as supernatural anymore. They don't regard sacred groves to be because when you start stop believing in the spirits, what I should say is the spirits which populated the tribal worldview or the indigenous worldview. When you stop believing that, I think a certain amount of their attitude towards even important practice like preserving sacred groves seems to be changing. So in this regard, what tribal activists, or at least what tribal researchers are trying to do, is how do they balance this idea of tradition as well as modernity. And this seems to be a huge debate as far as tribal societies are concerned, because we just can't stop telling tribal communities to stop modernizing. I think modernization is also very much part and parcel of any tribal society. So I think at this juncture of when we are talking about tribal worldview, or when we are talking about climate change, when we are talking about issues like sustainable livelihood, I think being able to really balance this traditional worldview as well as modernity, I think this will be a rather very arduous, very difficult task for the tribal communities. And actually many tribal researchers, or even tribes themselves, are trying to really engage with this kind of issue. The other aspect, I think Sir talked about this whole impact of climate change, and then how tribal worldview, as far as the indigenous worldview, is being able to actually mitigate or being able to bring some kind of solution to this whole challenge of climate change. One thing that I also observed is that as far as climate change is concerned, this is a very vast, its implication is very vast. And one thing that we are observing among tribes in Northeast India is that I can just give one example. I belong to a Naga community, and we have something called biological markers or zoological markers. So for instance, when certain flower blooms, it is time to sow maize. Or when certain bird sings, it is time to sow rice. So I think that this is indigenous people who don't have writing tradition, they have been able to actually make use of these zoological markers or botanical markers, plants and animals, to be actually able to understand the rhythms of agriculture cycle, able to understand the seasonal changes and all. But in what researchers, specific researchers who are doing work on issues of environment as well as these biological markers are saying is that because of the erratic nature of rainfall pattern, these biological markers seems to be not working anymore. Because even if the bird sings on time, even if a flower blooms on time, because of the change in the rain pattern, people are actually unable to really predict the sowing season or the harvesting season as such. So at this juncture, what we can suggest, or perhaps this is a humble submission of mine, is that this being able to blend various knowledge systems. I don't think we should at this juncture see modernity or see Western technology or see Western knowledge as something which is antagonistic the indigenous worldview. But I think we should be able to carefully, in a very, perhaps in a much more nuanced, perhaps in much more, in a very intelligent manner, being able to actually integrate this so-called, if I may, so-called Western knowledge system as well as the indigenous knowledge system to actually, mitigate climate change, also to talk about livelihood pattern, and also, to talk about sustainable issues as such. Because what I'm saying is that climate change has very large implication, and this is open to debate. I'm sure there are researches being done in different parts of the world among indigenous communities, but at least what we have observed in few places in India is that, I think there seems to be a limitation even to indigenous knowledge systems or indigenous worldview as far as mitigating climate change is concerned. Because I mean no disrespect, but our belief in the spirits, the so-called tribes living in harmony with nature, these things are changing radically. So at this juncture, being able to actually adapt to new knowledge systems, being able to integrate knowledge systems to preserve our knowledge system, also as well as to preserve our traditions and cultures. I think that is going to be a very, very important aspect of discussion at this moment. The other thing that I would also want to add to Professor Kaka's point is that Sir talked about how, when you look into at least in India, when you talk about forest cover or when you talk about the biodiversity, undoubtedly, I think forest cover and biodiversity seems to be much richer in the tribal areas where, the so-called indigenous people are dwelling or living. But one thing that we also have to observe, and one thing we also have to understand is that there seems to be this area are very much overwhelmed with developmental programs relating to climate change. So much so that we're also observing in name of plantation, in name of preserving forests. We also see instances where I think tribes are being, they are unable to actually have access to their traditional forest land, or have access to certain livelihood pattern that they have been following for tradition. So we should be able to really understand this, why that as far as developmental issues are concerned, as far as climate change mitigation is concerned, why tribal areas are being overwhelmed, why do tribal areas have to shoulder the larger responsibility of mitigating climate change with regards to plantation and with regards to reforestation and these kind of programs. I think climate change, this thing has to be a collective responsibility of the entire community, and then not just leaving it to tribal areas as such. Very quickly, I think at least some 40, 50 years, what was happening is that even today, tribes are being evicted because of certain developmental programs, or because of mining, because of construction, or because of other developmental activities. But we also see, at least in some tribal pockets, we are seeing that there seems to be, where tribes are facing livelihood crisis because of these, reforestation programs, or because of this whole developmental programs that is going on to mitigate climate change. So this, I think, being able to really critically understand this would take the discussion a long way. Yeah. So last thing that I really want to mention at this juncture is that whenever we are talking about tribal worldview, I think this is very much related to our livelihood. This is very much related to tribals, the livelihood pattern of the indigenous people as such. So what we are seeing is that when there is a drastic change in terms of change in the worldview, this is very much affecting even livelihood pattern. I can give an example from Northeast India, is that with the change in worldview, with the change in belief system, with the change in adopting, certain other knowledge systems, what we are finding is that certain practices, our knowledge of the forest or our knowledge relating to livelihood pattern, there seems to be a rapid decline when it comes to livelihood pattern, when it comes to economic livelihood as such. So why I'm raising this point is because whenever we are talking about climate change or whenever we are talking about environmental issues, I think for indigenous people, survival and economic livelihood becomes a very, very important part of this discussion. So being able to really understand, we have to acknowledge the fact that, as far as the worldview of indigenous people are concerned, this is transforming very fast. But in the face of this fast transformation, how we are able to actually preserve or retain certain traditional knowledge systems, I think that can help, or that can actually, contribute towards climate change mitigation as such. So these are some issues I think that we should be able to that we should be talking about, and this is something that we should be even going back to our own tribal communities and having this kind of discussion. So thank you, Dr. Kujur. With this very quick observation from Sir's lecture, I'm stopping here. If there's any questions or things like that, yeah, you may take over.
Thank you, Dr. Kanado.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so actually there are a lot of questions and I think you have partly also answered them. But now I actually want to ask a question to Professor Virginius. The tribals who had migrated from central India to tea gardens and other places for purposes, do you think that their worldview has changed because of their movement? And if so, how much the dependency or the non-dependency on the, maybe even adapting a new religion, how much of that has contributed to it?
You see, let's say, I'm not saying the large chunk, a substantial segment of the tribal population moved away from the worldview of what was considered to be the traditional worldview to, let's say, to the other views of the world religion. And this is much more pronounced, let's say, in Northeast than, let's say, in the peninsular India, but nevertheless, even in peninsular India. My own position is that although the worldview has changed, but to a great extent, the ethics really remains. And I don't think the ethics of what is there in Christianity and ethics that has been a part of the indigenous is in any way really much of the what is called a source of tensions and the conflict, except for the fact that where you think that certain kinds of traditions and customs, which they think that it is in serious conflict with the tenets or the ethics of the Christianity. So other than that, you find that they, particularly in addressing the natural world, I don't see much dichotomy between, let's say, what, of course, in Christianity, you have mastery the world, and when we go to the mastery of the world, you find that they have conquered the world and they have exploited and they have destroyed, and that is the reasons to the climate change. One can argue that. But nevertheless, I think if you really look at it in terms of the equality, the value, the sharing, the aspects of justice, I think even a traditional social system, you find that these are the core ideas. And I think that to some extent helps to govern. So even when you have moved away from your own traditional religion to the other worldview in terms of other religion, I do feel that there is a certain pattern in terms of which they actually cultivate, they address the natural world. And I don't think there is really much change. For example, I just give example. In case of Central Indian tribes, totemism is very important in the sense as to how you find certain clan associate itself with certain plants or species. And they have a kind of respect, what is called sacred attitude. So you find that you are not really supposed to kill, and that attitude remains. You don't really go and exploit, in the sense, the division of labor. So what I'm trying to say is that other than the fact which maybe Christianity will say that it is really goes against that ethics, you find that by and large, I don't see, one should really see a great deal of tensions and problems between, at least the way in which it has been practiced, let's say in Indian. I'm not really talking in terms of the way the Europeans have practiced in terms of conquering the world. I don't think Christians have really tried to conquer the world in India, because they are all mostly, they are almost on the margins of society. So I think that I don't see a tension between the two. That's the point of view I have. I might be wrong about it. And as far as coming to people who have migrated and settled elsewhere, now naturally, when you are not really dependent on the natural world for your everyday lives, you are no longer that. You are basically a labor. You are only someone who is providing a labor. Now, in that kind of situation, naturally, the worldview in terms of attitudes, and that is generational. But if you really take the first generation of people who moved as immigrants to Assam or Bengal, they had the similar kind of attitudes. This was there even in the 50s. When I was growing, I knew this. But today you find that there's completely severed the ties. There's no way. So the worldview has really undergone change because of the generational change, where you have no contact with the natural environment in which traditionally, historically, you had grown that. So that's the kind of the problem it is. So I hope I have responded to your queries.
Yes, sir. So because what I have found, I've although not lived very much in Agraghata, but I think, as you said, ethics, yes, do exist. But I think the supernatural part of what you call the relation of human nature and supernatural, I think supernatural is the one which I think is, getting, diluted and then becoming more progressive, as also Kanato is saying, that maybe a modernization of.
No, even there, I think when people become even Christians, they take a worldview. And if you really, there is always a separation between the elitist view, or let's say view of the priestly class, or view of the priests who are actually supervising the rites and rituals of the religion, and people who are practicing. And you find that people who practice, in fact, they are practicing Christian, but they also believe in various kinds of practices which are not in conjunction with it. So in other words, what you can, ordinary people, they synthesize. They are part of it, but then they also look into the local traditions and local traditional culture and try to see as to how they combine. And that's why you find always there's a authenticity and inauthenticity, true and false. These problems will come, that they are actually moving away from what is supposed to be true, what is supposed to be authentic, what is supposed to be real, and they are moving away and they're practicing. So there's more of a synthesizing, the synthetic view of the world, as kind of synthesizing or syncretistic view kind of things that you'll find. So people who are the margins, you will find are much more who are accommodating than people who are, let's say, a priestly class, who will try to follow to the tenet in a purest form. So that problem is there. So you have to look at not in terms of only the worldview, but in terms of the way they practice. And I would like to really focus more in the way they practice rather than in the worldview, because often we don't really conform to the worldview. We all try to make adjustment. And I think I don't see also the problem in terms of the fact that we should remain where we are. I think even traditionally, indigenous people have tried to adapt. They moved away from hunting and food gathering to shifting cultivation. From shifting cultivation, they moved to terrace cultivations. Terrace cultivations, they moved to settled agriculture. So you can see as to how in the history they have kept on adapting themselves. So the problem that is what you find, that are the tribals, at least I think world over probably, they have a rationality, but a rationality is one of adaptation and not of mastering the nature. The others have an adaptation, rationality, which is mastering. Christianity, if you really talk about, probably you'll find that the whole idea is that you have a rationality, and that through rationality, you are trying to conquer the world. You're trying to master the world. Indigenous people, they have an adaptation. They are rationality, but the rationality is one of adaptation. So I think if you really look at Weberian distinction, rationality based on conquering and mastering and rationality based on adaptation, then probably you will find that indigenous people have a rationality. And to say that they're always superstitious and not using rationality, that would be gross oversimplifications. And I think they won't have been able to survive. They're not really rational. And the whole life world, if you really look at, it is very much rational. But that rationality is one of adapting to the world around them. And that world around them is both natural as well as the supernatural in the way they have been viewed. Even supernatural is often adjusted. So I would like to look at in terms of more in the way they practice rather than more in terms of what the thinking may have been there. And often I find that the thinking that and what is called practice, you make a lot of adjustment. And that is how I think indigenous worldview can contribute to sustaining. So you have to keep on improving your standard of life. But as I said, that standard of life, even today, accumulation has come. Accumulation instinct is there now on us. But the people who are accumulating that instinct is very minuscule. But if everyone goes on accumulating, naturally, then you find it moving away from the ethical values of what the ancestors had or what your traditional system was there. And you are moving to, then that also affects your egalitarianism, your values of the what is called the reciprocity and all that. So then you started moving into accumulations and naturally the class differentiation, then it's exploitation, your own people will exploit your own people and so on. So that really is happening. I'm not saying that, but the scale that in which it is there is a nothing in comparison to the scale in which it takes place elsewhere. See, even in Northeast, I find that there is a huge disparity now in terms of income of the tribal. But if you really look at the social life, you don't find discriminatory practices. So when there's a marriage, you find that someone who is a domestic servant and someone who is even a politician or an IAS officer and a, very high ranking, they just interact with each other. So the tribal tradition is very different in certain sense. That kind of discriminations that you find at the social and the cultural sphere is not there, even when there is might be somewhere a distinction or differentiation in terms of economic status. So I think, and that's I think why you find that the class polarization does not take place in the context of tribal society, because social and cultural relations are very much integrated, and you find that you consider a belonging rather than being out of that, which is the case elsewhere. You find that when you have class, then you find also socially and culturally, you demonstrate that you are really very, very different. That doesn't happen, particularly in the case of indigenous people. It may happen next generation to come, but as of moment, I don't think that has really been happening. And that's why ethnicity becomes so important. People, irrespective of which class they belong, which economic status they belong, yet you find that ethnicity is so strong. And precisely because of this, because social and cultural dimensions have remained intertwined. And that kind of pronounced discriminations that you find in others kind of a society is relatively much, much weak in the case of the indigenous societies, or so-called tribal society. I might be wrong, but that is how I have seen that.
Yes, sir. So I think I completely agree. Also, I think maybe I understand a little more because I've seen it not much because I've not lived there much, but yes, that does make a difference. So Dr. Kanata, if you want to say something for a couple of minutes, then we'll close the session.
Yeah, so just whatever has to be said, I think Professor Kaka has put it very succinctly. But just the last comment that I want to actually leave at the moment is, because change is very much part and parcel of indigenous people society. Change is very much part and parcel of tribal society now. So at this juncture, I think the discussion, the research, or I think the debate should revolve around how, in the midst of this fast change, how do tribal people retain their, at least some aspect of of the indigenous knowledge system, or what we have been discussing about indigenous worldview, that can very much contribute to the whole climate change issue, also issues of food security as well as sustainability. I think this whole question of indigenous knowledge, it has become more cliche because everybody uses actually really trying to understand or really trying to introspect on it. But I think there's lots of scope. There's lots of advantages with regards to the tribal knowledge system, as well as what we call as the indigenous worldview in relation to the environment. So I think this has to be creatively preserved as well as promoted, for the environment as well as for mitigating climate change. Yeah. So I'll just leave that with this comment. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kujo. Dr. Archana, your audio is muted. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah. Yes.
So I want to, So I want to thank and Dr. Kanato for giving us these insights. And so we have learned a little more about the worldview and how it is changing and how we are adapting with time. Thank you so much, sir. With this, I would like to close the session.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.